Hello, vinyl community and Beatles division of the vinyl community. It's Matt, and I'm here to do a response video to Joe, Mean Mr Mayo. Joe had one of his viewers on his channel. I can't remember the name of the individual, and I apologize for that. But I guess the individual asked Joe about doing a 10 Beatles albums or Beatles related albums that mean something to you and why. And so I watched Joe's video, and it was very heartfelt. And I watched Fit to Be Tie-Dyed Paul's video. I watched Beatle Brad's entry to this response, and I was moved by all of them. I remember, I think I told Beatle Brad, that I love all his videos, but I thought that was probably my favorite video he ever did, because it was from the heart. Not that his other videos aren't from the heart, they all are. But this video was just so personal, and he told such great stories about the albums and why they mean something to him, that it just meant so much to me to see him open up like that and talk about how personal these albums were to him. The same with Fit to Be Tie-Dyed Paul. He told some wonderful stories related to his selections. And of course, Joe did. Joe picked some great albums, and he had some really good personal stories to tell about each one. So I thought, I don't want to waste too much time on this, but I want to thank Joe for doing that, for following his viewers' request to do these types of videos, your 10 Beatle or Beatle-related albums and what they mean to you, they mean the most to you. I want to thank him for that, because I think it's a great idea, and I'd like to say to Joe personally, Joe, you know, if you would come up with any more ideas like that, I think it would be great for the vinyl community Beatles division of the vinyl community, so to speak, all the folks out here who are part of that Beatles division of the vinyl community, that if people come up with some ideas, and I'll try to think of some myself, but that maybe every month or so, you know, like a few times a year, we should try to come up with something like this, because I think it's very personal, it's intimate, and it brings it right down to the forefront of what this band means to us and how it's affected our lives. So I'm going to be all for it and try to think of some ideas. I hope the rest of you in the vinyl community Beatles division, I like to call it, if you come up with some ideas, let's get them going, you know, once a month, once every couple of months, whatever. In addition to our regular videos, we all have our own little ideas and quirks and things we like to say and do in our own videos. But I'm just thinking beyond that, to maybe go a step further, and every month or so come up with an idea like this where we can all share and respond to one another with a similar topic. I think it's a great idea. So I'm going to get going on mine, and I hope Joe and the rest of you will forgive me a little bit. I only have like 10 stories or 10 personal stories to tell, but there's a couple of the stories, especially this first one here, where there might be more than one album that fits into that story. They're part of the same story, or the same memory, or the same personal meaning or emotional impact it's had on me. So I hope you'll forgive me for that if total albums go more than 10, but I don't think my stories will be more than 10. So forgive me, and I'll try to make this as concise as possible. So the first couple of albums that I'm going to show and talk about are these two. Now, those of you who saw my first ever video way back, video number 1, it was my introduction to the vinyl community. It was my personal tribute to this album right here, Meet the Beatles, on its 53rd anniversary of being released. And I look like a deer in the headlights in that video. I probably still do, but anyway, go back to my very first video when you see me looking like a deer in the headlights, and I'm trying to do my best to express my affection for this album. So in a nutshell, these were the first 2 albums I ever received as a young boy. And again, you can go back to that Meet the Beatles video to get more detail and more expanded. But when I was very young boy, 3 years old, the Beatles had first come to America. My parents, who were, you know, kind of part of an older generation in the sense that they were well into their 30s by the time the Beatles came to America in '64. And yet they had the foresight to see the enjoyment from this band and see all the craze they were creating with the young people of the day. And, you know, my mom had some nephews that were older than me, her brother's children, 3 boys who were into the band and whatnot. And I think she appreciated all that, and my dad did as well. And so they had their young oldest son, me, 3 years old at the time, and I think they felt, hey, let's get on the bandwagon and the craze a little bit and pick him up some Beatle albums and see how he does. Anyway, to make a long story short, these two mean a lot to me because these are not the originals, obviously, and if you go back to my first video, I do have my original vinyl of Meet the Beatles. They did buy me as a young boy at age 3. There's no cover, there's no sleeve, it's all beat up, it's scratched, but I do show it in that video, so you can go see that if you'd like. So these are, most of my albums today, by the way, will be originals, and the only 2 I think that are not are these 2. But anyway, at the age of 3, they bought me these 2 albums, this one first, Meet the Beatles, and then the Hard Day's Night soundtrack in mono, and this is a mono copy, and this is a mono Meet the Beatles. And basically, the story goes is that when I was very young, and I had one of those small spring rocking cowboy horses, if any of you remember those, if you're old enough. It was a little horse, either made out of plastic or whatever, and it was in a little it had 4 legs with springs. 4 springs attached to the horse's legs, and then the 4 bars on a little cross beam. And basically, you could put the child on the horse, and he could bounce up and down and sway back and forth and whatnot. Well, they used to put these 2 albums on, especially this one, as I explained in my first video. And they say I used to sway and bounce and jump up and down on that horse like a madman, like a little fiend, to the Beatles music, to these 2 albums. These were the 2 they got me. And especially this one, my dad says this one, Meet the Beatles, he said, I would constantly want it on. Like, I'd get on that horse and I'd want this album. I would point to it, whatever noises or talking I was doing at the time. But he said, this is the one I wanted played over and over and over again. And I couldn't get enough of it. And so, and this one was probably the secondary one, but they say that these were the 2 that they did buy me in '64 and that they did play for me. So these albums have a special place in my heart because my parents got them for me when I was 3. I enjoyed them at age 3. Every time I think of these 2 albums, I think of my parents and me being a young boy and how it started my fanship or fandom, so to speak, for the Beatles. And it set me on the path I'm off to now, almost 53 years later. I'll be 56 pretty soon. Yeah, I know I'm old. I think about that every day. But anyway, I'll be 56 soon. So 53 years ago, a little over 53 years ago, a young Matt, age 3, was bouncing around on his little toy horse to these albums and loving this group and appreciating them. And I just want to thank my parents, a personal, thank you to them, because these were the 2 that started it off. So again, Joe, I apologize. It's not just 1 album. I guess I could have made it just this one, but these were the 2 they bought me. And I want to say that these are my first 2 and special memories. Thanks. Okay, my second one is this album. This is my original. As you can tell, I'm not pulling out any minty ones. I do have minties and multiple copies of some of these albums, but I figure if I have the originals, show you the originals. So this is the original, and as you can tell, you can see I put, as a kid, I put Scotch tape on here, and it's turned all yellow over the years, but I Scotch taped the album up. Silliness now, but think about it, but I got a little tear in it down here, but this is my original Hey Jude album from 1970. This is an original. I got this within weeks after its release. And why this album holds a special place in my heart is because this was the first album I ever bought on my own. And when I say on my own, I was with my mom in a local department store. I was 9 years old, or I think I was going to be 9. This was released February of 1970. And as I say, I'm going to be 56 in a few weeks here. So I think I was 8 going on 9. And she took me to the department store. And, being around my cousins and seeing how much they liked the Beatles, they were a big influence on me listening to their Beatle records. My parents had bought me Meet the Beatles, as you saw in Hard Day's Night. Well, by the time I was eight or so, I really wanted to get my own Beatle records, even though I had the ones my parents bought me. So she took me out to the department store. Maybe she was going out for something else. And lo and behold, I wanted a Beatle record. I think I wanted Twist and Shout. I think I was looking for Twist and Shout. I might have spoke about that in one of my last videos because I had the Beatles story at this point. Remember the first two I showed you, I'm age 3. Well, as the years go by up to age 8, I think in the interim I did get 1 or 2 Beatle records, and one of them was Beatles Story, you know, the documentary album. And it has a 50-second snippet of the Beatles playing Twist and Shout live at the Hollywood Bowl. And it's, as I described in one of my earlier videos, it's rocking. It sends chills up your spine to hear those 50 seconds of them playing Twist and Shout live on that Beatles Story album. So I think I had that song in my mind around age 7 or 8 that I wanted Twist and Shout. When we get to the store, obviously they didn't have every album, or we couldn't find the album that had a Twist and Shout on it. And so I went with this one. For whatever reason, it was the newest one, or it was in the rack saying new releases by the Beatles, or maybe there was a big promo thing. I don't recall, but I do recall that for some reason I was drawn to this one, and she said I could have one record, one only, and my mom bought this for me. So this was the first record I bought on my own that I wanted out in the store seeking records. And so for that, it'll always hold a special place in my heart. And I did an earlier video more in depth on this album and telling some of that story also about buying it in the store. So if you want, you can check that out. But so my story number 2 and the album that holds special memory for me is the Hey Jude album, age 8, buying my first Beatles record. Special. Now the next 2, but it's one story, Joe, it's one story, but I have 2 here to show only because I know they are my originals, is I think I told you some stories. I think it was one of my last videos about how, I think it was my Beatles second album video. I did a little tribute to the Beatles second album not long ago, and I did show this copy. This is my original copy of it. The reason I showed this one is because it has a sticker from the old Jordan Marsh department store in Boston. And it was very special for me because back when I was a young boy, every once in a while, not every week or even every month, I can't even recall how often, but my dad, who liked music himself, would go into this Jordan Marsh to buy an album for my mother and himself, you know, different types of music. Someday I'll talk about the music albums of his I have. But anyway, every once in a while he'd pick a Beatles album up for me because he knew as a young boy, pre-teen, I loved the Beatles at this point. I'm talking, you know, early 70s, and he would once in a while come home with an album, and he would place it on my nightstand, similar to this back here. So when I would wake up in the morning, I had my own little tiny bedroom, and I'd wake up in the morning, my 2 younger brothers shared their own room, but I'd wake up in the morning and sometimes there'd be an album sitting there on the nightstand waiting for me because he worked late hours sometimes, and he would get home very late, and if we had school or whatever, we'd already be in bed. So I came home, I'd wake up in the morning, and I remember finding this one for sure. These are the 2 I do remember finding for sure. These are the originals that he had. This is Beatles 65. Again, you can see my tape job again on this one as well, like Hey Jude. For some reason, I was on a kick in the early 70s. I felt I was protecting my album's bindings by putting Scotch tape on them. Little did I know it was going to turn yellow after 40 plus years, nearly 50 years. But anyway, so they aren't original pressings because you can see they got the gold label award on each of them. But these were my originals. This one I put tape on it, and he had this on my nightstand. And then this one here, the second album, I talked about it in my Beatles second album video. It's still in the shrink wrap, and it still has the Jordan Marsh department store sticker on it. So my story here with this one, my 3rd story today of albums that mean so much to me and mean the most to me are these 2, because I know for sure these were 2 albums, these actual albums right here, my dad bought for me 40 plus years ago, back in the early 70s, and he placed them one at a time over a period of months on my nightstand so I could wake up in the morning and find them sitting there for me. So, and I just want to really thank my dad for doing that. He's going to be 87 shortly, and he's got some health issues right now. Thank God he's still doing fairly well and gets around, but he is going to be 87, and we're dealing with some health issues with him. And so I just, pray for him and hope he does well. But I just want to say this is a special memory for me, folks. These 2 albums, especially here, are the actual ones that he gave me and placed on my nightstand all those years ago. And I'll never forget him for that, and always thank him for that. So thanks, Dad. Going a couple of years later, the next one, next story, the next album that means the most to me is this one here. I think Joe, one of the other folks, showed, I believe, one of their fan club issue only or bootleg releases, but this is mine, and this means a lot to me because this is my first ever Beatles bootleg that I received. And I must have been on a kick for getting live Beatles because I heard Twist and Shout, that little snippet on the Beatles story. I wanted the song Twist and Shout. It really sparked something in me to hear the Beatles live like that and all that atmosphere and energy when they performed live back in the day. And for some reason, it was in a magazine, I believe, or something, that I saw an ad, and I asked my parents if I could please get this album. It was one of several advertised. And back in those days, you could get these kind of things and order them through the mail. I can't even remember how much it was, but it's the Beatles live at the Hollywood Bowl on August 23rd, 1964. It's the full set list, 11 or 12 songs, and of course with Twist and Shout on it. Now, obviously, folks, the quality on this is not certainly going to be as good as what Giles Martin did to the recent Hollywood Bowl release, which is just beautiful. It sounds so fantastic compared to something like this or even the 1977 release. But this is my first bootleg, Beatles Live at the Hollywood Bowl. I got this about 1973 or 74, I believe. It's very plain. The paper in it is just a loose paper inside. The album itself is just plain white label. It's a typical bootleg from back in the early to mid 70s. So that's my next one that means the most to me. Now, this one means a lot to me because this is my first ever white album. No, it's not an original pressing. It doesn't have a number on it. It doesn't have that high gloss shine like some of the original pressing ones, or all the original pressing ones did. It's my second run pressing, which I probably got sometime in the early to mid 70s. Again, me with the tape, you know, like all the tape I put around this thing trying to protect the bindings, all turned yellow now over time. But why this one means a lot to me is because I can't remember the author's name. I want to say it's Vincent Bugliosi. Vincent Bugliosi. I'm probably way off on this. I should have done my research first. But the gentleman who wrote the book Helter Skelter about the Charles Manson situation, and as you know, it's which I think it's a bunch of baloney how we shouldn't even think of that and relate it to this. But unfortunately, the story, all you Beatle fans that know the story about the whole Manson situation and related to the White Album and whatnot. But anyway, one of my parents was reading that book at the time in the 70s, and they came up to me and asked me about the White Album. Now I'm getting a little older. I'm like a real preteen, 12, 13 years old, 14 maybe. And they're asking me about the White Album and how they're reading this book about Manson and that whole Helter Skelter book that this Vincent whatever wrote. And they're asking me about this album. And the reason this album means a lot to me because it's the only Beatles album, and this is the original, this is the one I pulled out and played. This is the only Beatles album that I ever shared a listening experience with my parents. I don't know if maybe some of you others, you've done that with your parents, and God bless you if you have, that's great. But I never really did. I mean, think about it. How many, young preteens or teenagers sit down with their parents to listen to rock and roll together, get into an album together? Maybe some do. I do with my kids nowadays. We listen to music together, or have in the past. But back then, back in the 70s, it was a different generation than our parents who were born in the 30s and whatnot. And so to be sitting listening to rock and roll in the 70s with your parents was kind of like odd. But anyway, I did it. And this was the album I listened to with them. They wanted to hear many of the songs on this and see what all the fuss was about. And obviously there wasn't that much of a fuss. I mean, the music on this is beautiful. It's great. And I won't even mention that person's name again, who the book was written about and all that stuff. But this one has special meaning to me because it's the only album I ever sat and listened to where my parents asked me to play songs from it for them, and we listened to the Beatles together. So in that sense, it has some meaning for me. This one has meaning for me because this was the first solo album I really purchased on my own. I had been given solo albums prior to this. I had been given McCartney. I had been given Wings at the Speed of Sound a couple of years prior to this when I was like 14 or so. But this was the first McCartney album that I bought. It's still in my shrink. As you can see through the plastic here, there isn't a shrink wrap. But London Town, this was the first one in '78 that I went out and purchased on my own. And so even though it may not be McCartney's best in the world, I happen to like it. I think it's a great album. It holds a special meaning for me because this was so important to start discovering the solo stuff and purchasing it on my own. And this was my first Paul one I purchased on my own. Okay, next is a little series of albums. I'll start with this one real quick. I know I'm running on 20 minutes now. I apologize, but geez, there's so many good stories to tell. This is important to me, and this is an original also, because when I was in high school, my high school sweetheart at the time, a girlfriend, bought this for me for Christmas 1978, a nice picture disc of Sgt. Pepper. So it means something to me in the sense it was bought for me as a gift in high school by her. However, by the end of senior year, she dumped me. Which happens to so many young people, right? Well, this was the album, one of the next two I'm going to show you. This album really helped me out of that funk, that sadness, that depression of being dumped as a high school senior. I had signed up for the military to go into the U.S. Armed Forces right after high school. I was going to be shipped overseas. Ended up being 4 years active duty, 2 years reserves. 2 of those active duty years were overseas in Europe. And so it was a bummer for me to, right before I'm ready to graduate high school and go into the military and start my life or my future or building my future, that my girlfriend dumps me. You know, she couldn't handle it. She couldn't handle me going into the military or whatever. You know, whatever. Anyway, I'm long over it now, obviously. But anyway, at the time, it was devastating. I was depressed. I was down. And this album helped me out of that funk. This album, I listened to it nonstop. It came out March of my senior year, I believe, and this album was just so wonderful. It's so joyous and mellow, and the tones and the songs and the lyrics and the way George sings it, it just helped me so much. And this one did also. This is my original Rubber Soul. And these 2 albums during that period, that spring of my senior year of high school, right before I graduated and went into the military, these are the 2 albums that helped me out of that funk of a breakup with a high school girlfriend, which, you know, now as an old man or older guy, 56 years old, seems kind of frivolous, like who cares, you know? So some girl broke up with you when you were 17, big deal. But you know, back then, think about it, folks, when you were a young teenager in high school, and how so many different things could be so devastating to you and upsetting to you, and now you look back at them and go, what was I thinking? My God, you know, it was ridiculous for me to lose so much sleep and get upset and stressed out over this. It wasn't worth it. But anyway, thank goodness for these 2 albums, and they hold a special meaning for me because these 2 albums helped me through that difficult time as a 17-year-old boy getting ready to graduate high school and go into the service. I thank those albums because they really dragged me through that. I have to show this one because I know some of the other people have, but this one means so much to me because the joy I felt that late summer coming into early fall when we all first got the news that John was back after his 5-year retirement, was recording again, was making great music. And then I remember I was overseas in the military during 1980 now. I'm in the service and I'm overseas in Europe and we're getting wind that he's recording. Oops, something fell here. Anyway, we get wind that he's recording and he's maybe working with Cheap Trick. We read that in Rolling Stone magazine. He might be working with Cheap Trick. And so we were excited, you know, and he ended up working with Cheap Trick, but only on a couple of songs, and they didn't end up here. Obviously, later we heard them, but so it was such an exciting, joyous time that John was recording again. And then to go from that joy and then to what happened in December, that coming December was just devastating. And I mean, Paul, Fit to Be Tied, I talked about it. Joe talked about it. I think Brad talked about it. It's just, I won't belabor the point. It's devastating and still hurtful, and to this day, if I really let myself think hard about it and the what ifs and what could have beens. It's just so maddening and sad and depressing. So, but I will say that this album means a lot to me because it was the joy, the sheer happiness I felt when he was back and he was recording this. And the first time I heard Just Like Starting Over and how happy I was. And then to hear he was maybe working with Cheap Trick, like I said, and one of my other favorite bands, the high of that, you know, being up here, and then to have that come crashing down in December was just, it was awful, you know, for being a young, you know, 18 or 19-year-old, whatever I was, overseas, away from home in the military. It was devastating, but it has a special place in my heart because also 6 years later, my first son was born in 1986, my oldest, and the joy got brought back to this album again because in some of the video we made of him as a young boy and being born and whatnot, the primary song used was Beautiful Boy, Darling Boy from this album in my oldest son's videos. And so it's taken on a new meaning for me now that I have a 2-year-old grandson. And I see my 2 boys now, one age 30 and the other one age 27. And I say, thank God that they're all healthy and happy and doing well. And so that Beautiful Boy, Darling Boy song now means so much to me in my heart. And it's from that sadness and devastation of December 1980 to now being a source of joy and pride. That song and some of the other beautiful songs on this album, I look at this as a positive now that John left us with something joyous and positive and uplifting and hope for the future. And so thank you, John. And even though, you know, the tragedy that happened, it's awful. I thank goodness that we can turn that into what now is a positive and something we can look highly at and feel good about and know that he really put his heart into this album and left us with a resounding legacy that will never die. So thanks, John. And this means a lot to me because it came out in 1984. I know I skipped a little bit talking about my son being born with that one, but this one means a lot because the song on here, Grow Old With Me, was played at my wedding to my beautiful wife, my wife of 30 plus years now, 32 years. I love her so much. She's been a big support to me and help and has always supported my love for the Beatles. And so this album means a lot to me just for that one song in the sense that Grow Old With Me was played at my wedding. And every time I hear that song, no matter what incarnation or who's playing it or if it's a cover, it hits me right here in the heart. It reminds me of my beautiful wife. It reminds me of my family. And having, you know, life is ups and downs, and I don't have a perfect life. I've had my downs, as many as my ups, but it reminds me that I should be grateful for what I have and appreciate what I have, and I do so much. And so that song alone, Grow Old With Me, makes this album very meaningful. This album, almost done, folks. I apologize for the length. I hope you're sticking with me. Only 2 left, really. This album means a lot to me because I was going through a down period in the late 80s, 87, 88 specifically. Nothing serious, nothing too terrible, thank goodness, but a period where I really needed a boost. And I was getting it, I had a good support system, but when this album came out, and I remember the first time I put on the stereo, I'm not ashamed to say it, by the time I got to That's What It Takes, which I believe is only the second song, yeah, That's What It Takes, the second song, I had tears in my eyes. I had tears rolling down my cheeks. I'm not ashamed to say it. I remember just saying to myself, George is back. He's back. And tears running down my face. I was just so happy and excited. And it brought me so much joy to listen to this album. And I listened to it over and over and over again. And just like his George Harrison album did and Rubber Soul did for me on my high school breakup and how it brought me out of that funk a little bit, well, this one kind of brought me out of my funk in that late 80s period. And so I thank George for that because this album just blew my mind. And to this day, it's probably my top 1 or 2 favorite George albums. It means a lot to me. Okay, the one I dropped here. Okay. Real quick, these two go together in the sense that I talked about this on my other videos, why my Flowers in the Dirt video, why Flowers in the Dirt, and the resulting Tripping the Live Fantastic release in 1990 means so much to me. is because I met my bestest friend in the world, my Beatle buddy, my rock and roll buddy, my music buddy, whatever you want to call him, back in 1989. This was the first album when we first became friends, got into. This was the first tour we went to together. My youngest son was born not long after I went to my first Paul McCartney show ever with my best friend to this show. And if you want to see a funny story, go back to one of my other Flowers in the Dirt videos about how I had to make a decision whether to go to the Paul show or was my wife going to go into labor with my second son. But anyway, you can go back to those videos to see that. But anyway, these albums have that special memory for me during that period because I met my best friend in the world in '89. We went to our first Paul McCartney show ever together in 1990, the Flowers in the Dirt tour. And my son, my second son, was born. He's now 27, and he was born during this period. So these albums have special meaning to me, and not to be a downer, but my best friend in the world, he passed away last summer. I'll always hold a special place in my heart for him. He was a good friend, and I miss him very much. And whenever I think of Flowers in the Dirt or this tour, I think of my best friend, and I miss him. I loved him. And now I have the joy of thinking of my youngest son who was born during this period also, but it's a tribute to my friend, my best friend. And last but not least, and I'll close this, I promise, is not an album, but it's this box set. You might be saying, why is he showing the 2009 stereo remasters of the complete Beatles collection, the stereo versions? Because my wife knows what a big Beatles fan I am, and she knows I have so much stuff. She's never really attempted to buy me anything because she figures I have so much, like, you know, unless she never feels like she can beat me to it buying stuff. But this, my wife bought for me in 2009, bless her heart. She found a way to get out there and get this before I had a chance to get it when it first came out in '09, and it was a surprise gift that my wife bought for me. And I will forever be grateful to her and appreciate her buying me this stereo 2009 box set. So this will always have a special place in my heart. So there you have it, folks. I got through that pretty good, okay. I was worried. I think I told Joe, Mean Mr Mayo, I was worried about getting through this, but I think I did okay. A lot of joy to these albums and releases I showed you. There is some sadness mixed in, but like all things in life, there is the sadness, there's the joy, and we try to balance both and try to get through them and find ways, support systems with loved ones, family, and friends. And I have to say, you all have been kind of you've been a support system to me as well, because, you know, losing my friend last summer, who was my Beatles buddy, you've all become my Beatle buddies. You know, the VC, Beatles Division, you guys are great, and just being able to share ideas, communicate, learn things, feel support, feel like, you know, we care about each other. It's a good thing. It's a good feeling. So thank you very much. I know this went over 30 minutes. I hope you stuck with it. I know it was a kind of a serious video, but I think it's important what Joe did, that we talk about these meaningful records and how they mean so much to us, and how they've impacted our lives during the good times and during the bad times. So thanks, Joe. Thanks to your viewer, Joe, who gave you the idea. And let's do this again sometime. God bless you all. Take care. Have a great night. Bye-bye.